With the official release of the first licensed Joy-Con alternative in the form of Hori Split Pad Pro, there's now the very convenient timing of a new controller release from Ipega. Ipega. I still don't know how to actually pronounce the name of it. The point is, this is a new controller from a company that actually released one of the first Joy-Con alternatives that we reviewed over a year ago. So we're gonna see how this one stacks up against the competition. Now, if you're not familiar with this controller, this is actually the original one that we reviewed over a year ago. The final review of it was more or less that if you really wanted a larger, more comfortable grip design for the Switch instead of regular Joy-Cons, this was a good way to go that came with a very long list of problems, primarily based on the fact that this was not originally designed for the Switch in mind. It's clearly a tablet or phone style kind of controller, including the fact that it actually has the vice grip style attachment. Now, among the many issues it had, it required you to keep track of these rubber stoppers to make sure that the Switch would fit firmly inside of it, which I have lost, so I can't actually put the Switch in this anymore. The buttons were all completely switched up. The A's and B's were swapped in location, so games would actually control differently than they were normally meant to. And it was a wireless Bluetooth connection, which sounds great at first until you realize it loses connection every single time you put the Switch to sleep, requiring you to go through the entire pairing process every single time you want to use it. Thankfully, all of these problems cease to exist with the new controller, primarily thanks to the fact that it is actually designed for the Switch specifically in mind. One of the biggest changes being that instead of being a wireless Bluetooth connection, it plugs directly into the Switch via the USB-C port on the bottom. It's also a much more convenient design versus the original because instead of worrying about rubber spacers and having to actually use this kind of vice grip design, the Switch just slides in and out, no problem. The ABXY buttons are now also in their proper places instead of using the Xbox One style orientation, and whereas the previous controller was missing several buttons and had lots of workarounds to accomplish certain goals, they are now all present on this controller with all 4 shoulder buttons, plus, minus, home, and screen capture. It has all of these fixes while still offering the original selling points that made the first one tempting. A larger, more comfortable grip when compared to using regular Joy-Cons, larger sticks for more refined control, and the addition of a D-pad. But unlike the original, this one actually now has some competition in the form of a lot of other third-party grip designs and even officially licensed ones like the Split Pad Pro. So how does it compare to those? Now, something that's really important to keep in mind with a controller like this compared to, say, the Split Pad Pro is that this is an unlicensed controller still, and on top of that, it is a cheaper one, both in the sense of being more cheaply made, but also cheaper to buy in the first place. Hori Split Pad Pro goes for $50 on Amazon, whereas this controller you can grab for $30. So with that in mind, there is a certain degree of allowance of, well, what does the other one do better than this, and is that worth spending the extra money? Is it just better to grab this for the cheaper savings? And really, experience-wise, it works out pretty well as a controller. Like I mentioned earlier, it fixes a lot of the problems I had with the original Ipega controller, but there are a few specific areas where it's a little uncomfortable to use, and I think the biggest downside, honestly, is the sticks and D-pad. When it comes to the sticks, the initial feeling of them is fine. There's a little bit of resistance if you're doing full circular motions, but that doesn't come up super often, and it's still frictionless enough. It has good, nice movement. It's a pretty smooth feeling stick. The big problem, though, is the dead zone. There's a noticeably pretty large dead zone on this control stick. Now, we don't talk about that all the time on the channel, but if you're not familiar with it, the idea of the dead zone is how much you have to move the stick before it actually starts registering the input. Some controllers can have very tiny dead zones, which might be a little overly sensitive. Others can have ones that are way too big, where it oftentimes feels sluggish and maybe slow to respond. And that's the kind of situation we're ending up with this one here. I mean, you can start to move the stick quite a bit, and you'll see that it takes a while for it to actually register anything on the screen. The initial movement just doesn't read anything at all, and you really have to get it to more kind of the midpoint for it to start reading movements. Now, as for the D-pad, it's somewhat a similar situation in that it doesn't always necessarily read inputs quite as cleanly as I would like. It's fine if you're just trying to hit a specific direction, but as soon as you need to do something like a rolling input, or maybe you're moving to the right and then you want to change over to left, it just doesn't read swipe movements very well, and it'll keep reading the direction you're hitting first for a lot longer. Now, the D-pad, on the other hand, is, I think, better than the sticks, but it does still have a slight bit of a problem. It just is a very mushy feeling D-pad that doesn't read the most concise and clear inputs. It'll read just a simple direction very easily, but as soon as you start needing to do things like circular motions or any kind of more specific movement, it just starts to mix inputs up a lot and just doesn't work out quite as well. I don't think I'd really be very happy playing, say, a fighting game like Street Fighter with a D-pad like this. Aside from that, the rest of the experience is pretty good. I mean, none of this stuff is necessarily premium quality, but the ABXY feel fine, they get the job done. The shoulder buttons are a little bit loose, but still work fine. It is a perfectly serviceable, usable controller that is cheaper than the other options out there. It's just a matter of how much you're willing to pay more for quality. One other thing about this controller that does bother me a little bit from a functionality standpoint is I really wish it had some kind of USB-C pass-through, because to plug the controller into the Switch, you slot it in, takes up the USB-C port, fine, you're good to go. There's no other USB-C port on the controller itself, so if you wanted to, say, play a game while your Switch is low on battery, you want to use in handheld mode, you want to use this controller, well, that's not actually an option because your Switch is too low on battery and there's no way to plug it in while it's in this controller. Admittedly, that's kind of a situational thing, and you should just try to keep your Switch charged up as much as you can all the time, but it's still annoying if you want to use a controller like this as your main go-to. By the way, if you want an easy way to customize your regular Joy-Cons, a great option are skins like these from today's sponsor, dbrand. They come in a whole bunch of different colors and designs. You can even go spooky October themed with orange and black. You can get them for the Joy-Cons, the Switch itself, or even the dock. Check out the link down below for more info. When you're just talking the shorthand of what these products tend to offer, there's a lot of things that they have in common. They are both larger, more comfortable grips, especially if you're not used to the very small grip design of the regular Switch and you just have bigger hands, you need something that's going to actually accommodate you better. They both offer D-pads, they both offer larger sticks that give more refined control. A lot of the stuff on the surface level is the same, but there are some specific features that the Split Pad Pro offers that you can't get on the Ipega, and there's just also a question of, again, that quality level that you are also paying more to get. For instance, when it comes to special features, the Ipega doesn't really have any, it's just that it is a larger controller compared to using regular Joy-Cons. Whereas with the Split Pad Pro, you are getting those additional buttons on the back side to give you some reprogrammable options, as well as a turbo button to use for each side. I think it's also important to point out the difference in terms of how these two connect to the Switch. With the Ipega, you're slotting it in, which I think is a really cool idea, but again, does take up that USB-C port, whereas the Split Pad Pro is attaching to each side of the Switch just like regular Joy-Cons, keeping that USB-C port open. As well as opening up the odd choice of keeping a Split Pad Pro on one side with a regular Joy-Con on the other if there's some very specific reason why you'd want to do that. And then just to reemphasize it, the Ipega does have those pretty large dead zones on the sticks that the Split Pad Pro does not have an issue with. I think the really big takeaway when you're looking at these options for a larger Joy-Con alternative is that at the end of the day, the Split Pad Pro is simply the better option. However, it is also the more expensive one at $50 compared to the Ipega's $30. If you want to spend the least amount of money possible and just have something that gets the job done, the Ipega is honestly a perfectly solid choice. But if you want to have higher quality, you're willing to pay a little more, not to mention something that'll let you actually charge the Switch at the same time as you're using it, the Split Pad Pro is just simply the easier choice.